1241, the world stands on the brink of an unstoppable force. The Mongol Empire, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, has crushed every army in its path. Poland? Destroyed. Hungary? Annihilated. Now, only a few fractured kingdoms remain, trembling before the greatest war machine in history. And then, something happened. Something that saved Europe from complete destruction. And suddenly, Ögedei Khan is dead. The winter wind howled across the vast steppes, carrying the scent of war. Beneath the pale light of a crescent moon, an ocean of riders stretched as far as the eye could see. Thousands of Mongol warriors, clad in fur-lined armor, their bows slung across their backs, their horses restless beneath them, were poised to descend upon Europe like a storm. They were not merely an army, they were an unstoppable force, forged in the fires of war, disciplined beyond imagination, and commanded by the most fearsome leaders in history. The camp was alive with tension. Mongol warriors sat in clusters, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of the fires. Some murmured to their horses, their most trusted companions, whispering words of reassurance before battle. Others sat in quiet reflection, their eyes sharp and focused, knowing that by sunrise, blood would stain the snow-covered fields of Central Europe. Then, the silence broke. The first horn sounded, deep and resonant, rolling over the icy plains. It was not a sound of warning, it was a declaration of conquest. One by one, thousands of warriors swung onto their saddles. Their eyes burned with the certainty of victory, their hands steady on the reins of the beasts that would carry them to war. With a cry that split the night, the Mongol army surged forward, hooves thundering across the frost-bitten ground. They moved like a tide, an unrelenting wave of destruction rolling towards the west. Poland, Hungary, and beyond, Europe's doom had begun. To the Mongols, this was another chapter in their great conquest. But to the people of Europe, this march was the coming of the apocalypse. It was not merely an invasion, it was a force of nature, an event so cataclysmic that even today, historians struggle to fathom its full impact. Imagine being the farmer in Poland, hearing the distant thunder of hooves, seeing the black banners of the Mongols cresting the hills. Imagine being a knight, sworn to protect your kingdom, knowing that nothing you had ever faced could prepare you for what was coming. And now, I ask you, what if you were there? What if you were a soldier in the path of the Mongol horde? Would you stand your ground, or would you run? Would you fight to the death, or surrender in the hopes of mercy? The Mongols did not believe in mercy. They believed in domination. And that belief shaped the world. What would you do if you saw the Mongol horde approaching? Would you fight? Would you flee? Tell us in the comments below. The sky above Krakow burned with an unnatural glow. Smoke thickened the air, choking those who dared to flee, while the distant roar of fire devouring homes and churches filled the night. Screams echoed through the narrow streets, swallowed by the unrelenting clash of steel and the thunderous gallop of hooves. The Mongol horde had arrived, and with them, the promise of annihilation. In mere hours, Krakow, a city that had stood for generations, was reduced to ashes. The defenders fought bravely, their swords clashing against the seemingly endless wave of Mongol warriors. But bravery was not enough. Arrows, loosed from the expert hands of Mongol archers, rained down like deadly hail, piercing armor, cutting down soldiers and civilians alike. The streets, once bustling with merchants and traders, now ran red with blood. Further south, Hungary met the same fate. The mighty kingdom, once a stronghold against foreign invaders, now stood defenseless. The plains outside Pest were littered with broken banners and fallen knights. The Mongols moved like ghosts, appearing from the darkness, striking with terrifying precision. There was no warning, no time to prepare. Villages vanished overnight, their inhabitants either slain where they stood or taken as captives, prizes of war to be marched eastward into servitude. Survivors whispered of horrors unimaginable. The screams of children torn from their families, the church bells that once signaled prayer now ringing out an alarm before crumbling beneath flaming rooftops. The Danube River, once a symbol of prosperity, now bore witness to an unspeakable massacre. The waters ran thick with the fallen, their bodies floating downstream as a grim testament to the Mongol wrath. And yet, the Mongols did not simply destroy. They conquered. With brutal efficiency, they imposed their rule, their banners rising over the ruins of what was once a thriving land. The people of Poland and Hungary, once proud and free, now bowed before foreign warlords, their fate no longer their own. Those who resisted met only one end, swift, merciless death. And so, Poland and Hungary burned, not as isolated tragedies, but as the first victims of a storm that threatened to consume all of Europe. Those who witnessed the destruction spoke of it in hushed whispers for generations. Even today, the echoes of that devastation remain in history's memory, a warning of what could have been, or what could be again. In the grand halls of medieval castles, where once noble feasts and diplomatic pleasantries took place, now only the echo of dread-filled voices remained. Kings, princes, and high-ranking lords from across Europe had gathered, their faces shadowed by the flickering glow of candlelight. The air was thick with desperation, for they all knew Europe stood at the precipice of annihilation. From the west, the King of France clenched his jaw, eyes scanning the parchment before him, reports of entire cities wiped from existence, of Polish and Hungarian armies obliterated. The Mongols had moved with a speed no European force could match, their warfare a terrifying mix of strategy and brutality. From the east, the Holy Roman Emperor stood in stoic silence, his fingers drumming against the cold stone table, weighing his limited options. Could his fragmented empire unite in time? Could centuries of internal feuds be cast aside for the survival of Christendom? We must act now, or there will be no kingdoms left to rule, one of the gathered voices pleaded. Yet, even in the face of destruction, doubt filled the room. Could proud monarchs who had warred against one another for decades suddenly trust each other? Could alliances be forged? Or would Europe fall, not by the might of Mongol steel, but by its own stubborn pride? A lone messenger entered the chamber, his clothes stained with the dust of travel, his breath labored. "My lords," he gasped, "Buddha has fallen. The Mongols are unstoppable." The room, already heavy with tension, turned deathly silent. Across the gathering, some exchanged hopeless glances, while others gripped their swords in anger. The fate of Europe hung in the balance, and they knew the time for words was nearly over. Soon, only war, or surrender, would remain. In that moment, the destiny of a continent was shaped not by armies, but by the whispered words and uncertain glances of men who ruled nations. And as history would soon reveal, even the greatest kings could not stop the storm that was coming. April 11th, 1241. The banks of the Sejo River, near the village of Mohi, became the stage for Hungary's final stand. King Bela IV, battered but determined, had gathered what remained of his forces. The Mongols had moved with terrifying speed, their campaigns leaving only devastation in their wake. But here, on this blood-stained ground, the fate of a kingdom would be decided. The Hungarian army, numbering in the tens of thousands, had constructed a fortified camp, wooden wagons forming a desperate barricade against an enemy that had never known defeat. Knights in heavy armor stood shoulder to shoulder with peasant militia, their faces hardened by fear and duty. Priests moved through the ranks, blessing weapons, whispering prayers to a god that many feared had abandoned them. Then, from the darkness, it came, the first sign of death. A single Mongol arrow, cutting through the morning mist, embedding itself in the chest of an unsuspecting soldier. A moment of silence, then chaos. The Mongols attacked with unrelenting fury. Waves of horse archers, their movements impossibly fast, loosed thousands of arrows into the Hungarian ranks. Shields shattered, men fell, screams of the wounded pierced the air. The walls of the camp trembled. Under the impact of Mongol siege weapons, their engineers having learned the art of destruction from conquered lands far to the east. King Bela IV rode through the ranks, urging his men to stand their ground. "Hold! Hold!" he cried, his voice lost in the storm of battle. The knights, clad in steel, charged forward in one final, desperate attempt to break the Mongol lines. For a moment, it seemed as if the tide might turn. Mongol riders were thrown from their saddles, Hungarian swords clashed against enemy armor. But it was an illusion. Batu Khan, commander of the Mongol horde, had planned for this. He feigned a retreat, drawing the Hungarian cavalry away from their fortified position, exposing their flanks. And then, like a closing trap, the Mongols struck from all sides. A second force, hidden beyond the hills, emerged, cutting off any hope of escape. The Hungarian army, surrounded, was slaughtered where they stood. Blood soaked the earth, bodies lay in heaps, the cries of the dying lost to the wind. King Balab barely escaped with his life, fleeing westward, his kingdom shattered behind him. The Mongols did not pursue, for now. They had achieved what they came for. Hungary was broken, and the road to the rest of Europe lay open. In the aftermath of Mohi, no one could deny the truth any longer. Europe's defenses had crumbled. The Mongols were not just warriors, they were the reapers of civilization, carving a path of fire through history. The last stand at Mohi was not just a battle, it was a reckoning. A moment in time when the fate of an entire continent teetered on the edge of oblivion. As news of the Mongol devastation spread across Europe, the Eternal City stirred with unease. In the grand halls of the Lateran Palace, Pope Gregory IX stood before his council of cardinals, their faces pale with fear. The unstoppable tide of destruction had swallowed Poland and Hungary. Now, the question loomed, would Rome be next? The air was thick with the scent of burning candles and aged parchment, the only sources of light within the shadow chamber. Priests and envoys from distant kingdoms filled the hall, whispering prayers, desperate for guidance. In hushed tones, they recounted the horrors told by refugees, the Mongols struck with a fury unlike anything seen before. No walls could hold them, no army could resist them. Was it the wrath of God? Or the hand of the devil himself? The Pope, draped in robes of white and crimson, raised his hands to silence the growing murmurs. My brothers, we stand at the precipice of annihilation. Our kingdoms are divided, our lords quarrel among themselves while a storm approaches. If we do not stand united now, Christendom will perish under the hooves of the Mongols. His voice, once weary with age, rang with a newfound resolve. The urgency of the moment ignited action. Letters were dispatched to every kingdom of Europe. To the French, to the English, to the Holy Roman Emperor. The call was clear: set aside your rivalries, march under one banner, and prepare for a war unlike any before. The papal legates rode swiftly, carrying messages demanding aid, promising salvation to those who answered, and damnation to those who faltered in the face of this apocalyptic threat. But war alone would not save them. The Pope declared a day of fasting, calling upon the faithful to pray for divine intervention. From the Vatican to the smallest village church, the bells of Christendom rang out, their echoes reaching even the most distant corners of Europe. Monks filled the streets in solemn processions, chanting prayers for deliverance. The relics of saints were brought forth, paraded through Rome in hopes that their divine favor would shield the city from destruction. Yet, even as the church sought the hand of God, some among them questioned whether faith alone would be enough. The Mongols had shattered armies far greater than Rome's. If the princes of Europe did not answer the Pope's call, if their pride and greed kept them divided, then even the holy city itself might not be spared. As the sun set over the Vatican, the Pope knelt in his private chamber, his hands clasped in fervent prayer. Lord, give me a sign. Show me that our cause is just. Outside, the torches burned long into the night, casting flickering shadows against the ancient walls of Rome. The city waited, the world watched. And beyond the Alps, the Mongols came closer still. The autumn winds carried the scent of blood and smoke as the Mongol horde thundered toward the gates of Vienna. The once great city, the jewel of the Holy Roman Empire, now stood as the last bastion between civilization and annihilation. The defenders lined the battlements, their faces weary but determined. They had seen the devastation in Poland, the ruin of Hungary. They knew what was coming. The first Mongol scouts had appeared on the horizon days before, their dark silhouettes barely visible against the golden fields of Austria. Then came the siege engines, massive trebuchets, wagons of fire, and towers built with ruthless precision. The sound of war drums echoed across the land, a slow, methodical rhythm that sent chills down the spines of those within the city walls. Batu Khan, ever the master tactician, watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. He did not need to rush. Vienna was already cut off, its supply lines severed, its defenders isolated. The Mongols did not need numbers to win. They needed patience and fear, both of which they had in endless supply. Then, the first strike. A hail of flaming arrows arced through the sky, descending upon the rooftops of Vienna like a storm of fire. Homes ignited instantly, the dry autumn air fueling the inferno. Smoke choked the streets, screams filled the night. The people of Vienna, trapped within their walls, could do nothing but watch as their city burned. Within the fortifications, Duke Frederick II paced restlessly. Messages had been sent to the Holy Roman Emperor, to the Pope, to any who would listen. "We must hold," he muttered, though the words felt hollow. Outside the walls, the Mongols were relentless. Siege ladders rose, battering rams thundered against the gates, and enemy archers picked off defenders one by one. The city's fate teetered on the edge of destruction. For days, the battle raged. Every attempt to sally forth was met with disaster. The Mongols feigned retreats, luring the knights of Vienna into ambushes where they were cut down mercilessly. The defenders fought bravely, but bravery was no match for the calculated ferocity of the Mongol war machine. Yet, even as hope dimmed, whispers spread among the ranks. News from the east. Something had happened. A disruption within the Mongol ranks. Batu Khan had paused the assault. Messengers rushed into the command tents, voices hushed but urgent. Then, without explanation, the order was given: the Mongol forces would withdraw. The siege of Vienna was over, not because of a grand victory by its defenders, but because of something far greater. Ögedei Khan was dead, and the Mongols had been summoned home. Vienna stood, but it was forever changed. The city had seen the end of the world and barely survived. Though the Mongols had vanished as swiftly as they had arrived, their shadow loomed over Europe. And in the quiet halls of power, rulers and warriors alike asked themselves one chilling question: what if the Mongols had never left? News of the Mongol advance had spread like wildfire across the kingdoms of Europe, and in France, the whispers of impending doom grew louder with each passing day. The ruins of Hungary and Poland served as grim reminders, castles reduced to rubble, entire armies slaughtered to the last man. If France was to avoid such a fate, it had to act now. King Louis IX, young but resolute, called upon his noblest lords to Paris. Within the towering walls of Notre Dame, the kingdom's greatest warriors, strategists, and commanders gathered beneath candlelit chandeliers. The air was thick with tension, the weight of an uncertain future pressing upon them all. The Mongols had crushed knights, kings, and emperors alike. What hope did France have against such an enemy? "We have no choice," declared the king, his voice cutting through the chamber. "If we stand divided, we shall fall like the rest. We must prepare, not only for battle, but for survival itself." The words rang with conviction, but behind his eyes, doubt lingered. The French armies were strong, their fortresses formidable, but would they be enough? Across the kingdom, orders were dispatched. Blacksmiths worked tirelessly, forging weapons and reinforcing castle walls. Messengers rode to distant lords, summoning their banners under the royal standard. The monasteries echoed with prayers, monks pleading for divine intervention to spare their homeland from the fate that had befallen their eastern brethren. Yet, the looming specter of past failures haunted them. At Legnica, the Polish knights had been slaughtered, their heavy armor proving useless against Mongol agility. At Mohi, the Hungarian kingdom had crumbled in a single night. France had to learn, adapt, and prepare for a war unlike any it had ever faced. Tacticians studied Mongol warfare, their tactics dissected and debated. They knew that the cavalry of France, powerful yet cumbersome, would struggle against the speed and precision of the enemy. Defensive formations were devised, new battle strategies formed. The castles along the eastern border were reinforced, their stone walls standing as the last line of defense between the Mongols and the heart of Europe. But would it be enough? Could faith, steel, and strategy overcome an enemy that had never known defeat? Only time would tell. As the watchtowers of France stood vigilant, torches burning bright against the night, all eyes turned eastward. The storm was coming, and France had only begun to brace itself. The cold winds howled through the narrow streets of London as the city's great halls filled with whispers of dread. The fires of Poland and Hungary had long since died, their ashes carried eastward by the Mongol advance. Vienna stood battered, Paris braced itself for war, and now, across the English Channel, the fear had finally reached England's shores. The question on every nobleman's lips was the same: would the Mongols come for them next? Inside Westminster, the flickering glow of candlelight cast long shadows over England's most powerful lords. King Henry III sat at the head of the chamber, his fingers drumming against the oak table as heated voices rose around him. His nobles, once divided by land and petty rivalries, now found themselves united in uncertainty. Some called for immediate action, to raise an army, to fortify castles, to prepare for an invasion that may never come. Others urged caution, reminding the room of England's isolation, of the waters that separated them from the devastation consuming Europe. If the Mongols come, our walls will not stop them, one baron muttered, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. We must prepare now, before it is too late. Another scoffed, shaking his head. Prepare for what? A ghost? Have you seen the Mongol fleet? Have you seen them build ships? No? Then let them try and cross the channel, and we shall watch them drown. The room fell silent. No one knew the truth. No one knew whether the Mongols could be stopped. But the fear remained, creeping into the marrow of every man present. Beyond the castle walls, the people of London whispered of omens. Priests spoke of judgment, of a reckoning from the east. Blacksmiths forged weapons, merchants stockpiled food, mothers held their children close at night, whispering prayers for a salvation that seemed ever more distant. The English fleet patrolled the waters restlessly, their captains scanning the horizon for ships that might never come, waiting for an enemy that may never arrive. King Henry stood, his voice cutting through the silence. We do not know if the Mongols will come. But we do know that the world is changing, and that the strong will survive. We must be ready. And so, orders were given. Watchtowers reinforced, castles resupplied. The English army, long idle in the wake of its internal conflicts, was placed on high alert. Across the land, from the shores of Dover to the far reaches of Scotland, England braced for the storm, even as they prayed it would never reach them. And so London waited. The nobility debated, the armies prepared, the people whispered. Whether by steel or by sea, England would not be caught unprepared. But in the quiet halls of Westminster, one truth remained unspoken: if the Mongols truly set their sights upon England, no fortress, no army, and no divine intervention would be enough to stop them. While Europe reeled from the relentless Mongol onslaught, another battle was being waged, not with swords and arrows, but with words. Across the courts of kings and emperors, envoys of the great Khan arrived, their presence alone a harbinger of doom. Clad in silken robes embroidered with the insignia of the Mongol Empire, these messengers carried a single ultimatum: submit or be destroyed. The letters they bore were written in elegant but commanding script, signed with the seal of the Mongol court. To the rulers of Europe, they read, "Your lands are now within the gaze of the great Khan. We come not as mere invaders, but as those chosen by the heavens to bring order to the world. Swear fealty to the Mongol Empire, open your gates, and spare your people from annihilation. Resist, and know that no fortress will stand, no army will triumph, and no God will save you." In the courts of France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the papacy itself, the arrival of Mongol envoys sent shockwaves through the nobility. Some called for defiance, their pride unwilling to bow before an Eastern power. Others, recalling the horrors of Poland and Hungary, hesitated. Could Europe withstand what so many before them could not? Was it wisdom to fight, or folly? At the court of Emperor Frederick II, the Mongol envoys stood impassive as arguments erupted around them. "We are not mere barbarians," one of them calmly stated. "We do not conquer for pleasure, but for unity. The weak resist. The wise adapt." Their words were chilling, not because they were threats, but because they were spoken with such certainty, as if the fate of Europe had already been decided. Pope Gregory IX, however, was unwilling to negotiate. In Rome, the papal court denounced the Mongols as the scourge of Christendom. "These are not men," the Pope declared, "but devils riding in human form. We shall not bow to them." His words were bold, but behind closed doors, even the Vatican was uncertain. Could faith alone hold back an army that had shattered the world's greatest kingdoms? As the envoys departed from the courts of Europe, their message had been delivered. The Mongols would wait for an answer, but not for long. Whether by diplomacy or by force, the great Khans would be done. And as the Mongols sharpened their blades beyond the borders, Europe stood at a crossroads: submit and survive, or resist and perish. The time for decisions was near. War had long been the Mongols' domain, but their genius lay not only in their cavalry or their archery, it was in their ability to adapt. They had conquered civilizations from China to Persia, learning and refining every military technology they encountered. And now, as their forces reached the heart of Europe, they unveiled their deadliest innovation yet: gunpowder. The Chinese had harnessed its power for centuries, using crude bombs and fire lances. But under Mongol ingenuity, it became something more. In their hands, gunpowder was not just a tool of terror, it was a weapon of conquest. Bombards and firepots were loaded onto siege engines, their fuses burning bright as they soared over the walls of besieged cities. Fortifications that had stood for centuries now trembled beneath explosions never before seen in Europe. The first true test came at Vienna. As the city's defenders took their positions atop the battlements, they expected the usual tactics: the endless waves of cavalry, the sudden feigned retreats. But what they saw instead was far worse. The Mongols wheeled forward strange iron tubes, their ends glowing with embered wicks. A moment later, the night was torn apart by deafening roars. The ground shook. The walls cracked. And for the first time in history, the battlefield was filled with the acrid scent of burned sulfur and saltpeter. Knights in gleaming armor, once invincible against arrows, found their defenses meaningless. The blasts hurled them from the walls, their steel carapaces useless against the force of the explosions. Panic spread like wildfire among the defenders. How could one fight an enemy that wielded thunder itself? The Mongols, ever pragmatic, did not waste time marveling at their success. They refined their tactics, incorporating the deadly new weapons into their battlefield strategies. Soon, cavalry charges were preceded by volleys of exploding shells, city gates were reduced to smoldering splinters, and entire armies broke formation under the sheer shock of these hellish devices. Europe, long accustomed to the clash of swords and lances, was wholly unprepared for the dawn of this new kind of warfare. As cities fell and word of this terrifying new weapon spread, whispers of despair reached the courts of kings and emperors. Could this be the end of chivalry? The end of knights? If the Mongols mastered this art, if they perfected its use, then nothing, not castles, not walls, not even armies, could stop them. The age of the sword was ending. The age of gunpowder had begun. Across the frostbitten plains of Eastern Europe, a lone rider pushed his horse beyond the limits of endurance. His furs were caked with ice, his breath short and ragged, but he did not slow. He carried something far more pressing than hunger or exhaustion. He carried the fate of an empire. The Mongol forces, stretched across the heart of Europe, had never been stronger. Victory was inevitable. Vienna's walls trembled under siege, the French lords quarreled over their next move, and England prepared for a war it could never win. But none of them knew what was coming. Not even the Mongols themselves. Through forests, over rivers, and across vast fields of snow, the rider pressed on. He bore the seal of the great Khan himself, a message meant only for Batu Khan, the leader of the Western invasion. The war could wait. This message could not. Days passed, and finally, the messenger reached the Mongol war camp. His horse collapsed beneath him as he dismounted, staggering forward, gasping for breath. The guards recognized the symbol on his chest, the urgency in his eyes. They did not delay. The flaps of Batu Khan's tent were thrown open, the warlord rising from his maps, his commanders falling silent. The room darkened as the cold wind followed the messenger inside. "Speak," Batu ordered, his voice calm but commanding. The messenger dropped to his knees, pulling a sealed scroll from within his robes, his hands trembling. "It is the great Khan. Ögedei, he is dead." The words hung in the air, their weight suffocating. For the first time in months, silence filled the Mongol camp. Ögedei Khan, son of Genghis, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever known, gone. The unthinkable had happened. Batu's hands tightened into fists. His conquest of Europe, so close to completion, was now in question. By Mongol law, the generals must return home to elect a new ruler. The invasion could not continue. Not now. Not yet. A single message, carried by one man, had halted the greatest invasion in history. Europe, battered and broken, had been granted an unexpected reprieve. But would it last? And if the Mongols returned, would the continent be ready? The night was cold and silent, the Mongol war camp stretching across the plains like a restless beast waiting to strike. Inside the largest tent, a gathering of the empire's greatest warriors huddled over a map of Europe, plotting the next phase of conquest. Their strategies had been perfected over decades, their enemies had fallen like wheat before the scythe. Victory was within reach. Then, the tent flaps were thrown open, and a breathless messenger staggered inside. His clothes were caked with ice and dust, his face gaunt from an impossible journey across the frozen steppes. But he had no time for rest. Dropping to one knee before Batu Khan, he produced a scroll sealed with the insignia of the Mongol royal court. The chamber fell into silence as Batu took the message and broke the seal with careful hands. The words within changed everything. Ögedei Khan, son of Genghis, ruler of the Mongol Empire, was dead. The room remained still, as if the weight of history itself had pressed down upon them. Batu's grip tightened around the parchment. Every Mongol general knew what this meant. By the laws of succession, all commanders must return to Karakorum to decide the next ruler. The conquest of Europe, so close to completion, had to stop. Subotai, the empire's greatest strategist, studied Batu with unreadable eyes. "The enemy is broken," he finally spoke, his voice cold and measured. "One final strike, and the continent is ours." But Batu knew better. Defying the laws of succession was unthinkable. The unity of the empire depended on it. And so, despite the fires burning on the horizon, despite the battles yet to be won, Batu made the decision that no Mongol warrior wished to hear. "We march for Karakorum," he declared. The words echoed through the tent, carried by whispers and gasps. Some clenched their fists in frustration, others nodded in understanding. No one spoke against Batu, for the decision was not his alone. It was the will of the empire. Messengers were dispatched across the land, riding through the night to halt the advancing armies. In an instant, the Mongol war machine, unstoppable, relentless, was turning back. The fields of Europe, once certain to be drenched in blood, now stood in eerie silence. The defenders, battered and broken, watched in disbelief as the enemy retreated not in defeat, but by choice. The Mongols had not been beaten. They had simply been called away. And in the minds of those left standing, one terrifying thought remained: what if they returned? The world had watched in terror as the Mongol war machine carved a path of devastation across Europe. Cities burned, kingdoms fell, and the great armies of Christendom were shattered like glass against the unrelenting tide. It seemed as though nothing could stop the inevitable, until, suddenly, the tide turned. As winter's chill crept over the battlefields of Europe, something unprecedented happened. The Mongols, who had known nothing but victory, began to withdraw. From the plains of Hungary to the outskirts of Vienna, scouts reported the same bewildering sight: Mongol war camps dismantled overnight, banners lowered, siege weapons abandoned. The invincible army was turning back. But why? No force had bested them. No army had forced them into retreat. The answer lay not in Europe, but thousands of miles away in the Mongol heartland. News had arrived, news that would shake the empire to its core. Ögedei Khan, ruler of the Mongol Empire, was dead. The great Khan, whose word had shaped the destiny of nations, had fallen, and with his death came a summons. The generals were needed in Karakorum to determine the next ruler. By law, the conquest had to pause. Batu Khan, the mastermind of the European campaign, received the order. With clenched fists, victory was within reach. Europe lay vulnerable, its defenders battered and broken. One final push, and the continent would be theirs. But Batu knew the consequences of disobedience. The unity of the Mongol Empire was sacred. Without it, their dominion would crumble into chaos. And so, with reluctant hands, he gave the command. The Mongols vanished as swiftly as they had arrived. The once unstoppable horde melted into the eastern horizon, leaving only smoldering ruins and whispered fears in their wake. European cities, once doomed to fall, stood untouched, their defenders watching in stunned silence as their would-be conquerors disappeared. What had felt like the end of the world had become an inexplicable miracle. But make no mistake, this was no surrender. The Mongols had not been defeated, only delayed. The kings of Europe knew that this retreat was not the end of the war, but merely a pause. And as the dust settled over the abandoned battlefields, one terrifying thought echoed through the halls of power: what if they returned? The unthinkable had happened. The Mongols, the unstoppable force that had shattered armies and razed entire cities, had turned back. Across Europe, the silence that followed their retreat was almost as deafening as the chaos they had left behind. Kings, lords, and commoners alike stood frozen, their minds struggling to grasp the enormity of what had transpired. One moment, the world had teetered on the edge of collapse. The next, the invincible enemy was gone. In the shattered remnants of Hungary and Poland, survivors crawled from the ruins of their homes, staring in disbelief at the empty horizons. The destruction had been absolute, and yet, the invaders had vanished like ghosts. The once mighty castles that had crumbled under Mongol siege engines now stood eerily silent, their defenders left to wonder if the nightmare had truly ended or if it was only beginning. In Rome, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang out in celebration. The Pope and his cardinals, who had prepared for what seemed like the end of Christendom, declared the Mongol retreat an act of divine intervention. God has spared us, they proclaimed. But beneath the prayers of gratitude, whispers of fear remained. Would the Mongols return? Would they finish what they had started? Across the royal courts of Europe, there was no triumph, only uncertainty. In France, King Louis IX pondered whether this was truly a reprieve or a cruel trick. In England, Henry III hesitated, wondering if the Channel had truly shielded his kingdom from the storm. And in the Holy Roman Empire, Emperor Frederick II sat in brooding silence, knowing that Europe had not survived by its own strength, but by a mere twist of fate. Some saw the retreat as an opportunity, an unfinished war that could still be won. Tattered armies regrouped, fortifications were rebuilt, and strategies were redrawn. But others, the wiser among them, understood a more terrifying truth: Europe had not defeated the Mongols. The Mongols had left on their own terms. And if they returned, the continent would not survive a second time. For now, Europe had survived. But survival was not victory. And as the fires of war smoldered in the east, one question haunted every ruler, every soldier, every survivor: what if the Mongols came back? In the halls of the Vatican, the bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang in triumph, their echoes resounding through the streets of Rome. Priests and cardinals filled the grand cathedral, their voices rising in prayers of thanksgiving. The unthinkable had happened. The Mongols, the scourge of Christendom, had turned back. But why? In the eyes of the Holy See, there could be only one answer: divine intervention. Pope Gregory IX, draped in golden vestments, ascended the steps of the high altar, his face illuminated by flickering candlelight. He stood before a congregation of Europe's most powerful clerics and emissaries, his voice steady yet filled with conviction. "The Lord has heard our cries," he proclaimed. "The armies of hell rode against us, and yet, by his will, they have vanished like mist before the morning sun." The faithful gathered in the thousands, kneeling in the streets, their hands clasped in prayer. Word spread quickly across the continent. From Paris to London, from Vienna to the furthest reaches of the Holy Roman Empire, the message was clear. This was no mere political retreat, no twist of fate. It was a miracle. To the rulers of Europe, the Pope's declaration was a gift. Kings and emperors, who had stood on the brink of ruin, seized upon the narrative, reinforcing their rule with the divine authority it provided. "God has spared us," they told their people. "Through our faith and steadfastness, we have been delivered." The Mongols, once seen as an unstoppable force, were now cast as agents of darkness who had been repelled by the unwavering piety of Christendom. But beneath the grand proclamations and public celebrations, some rulers remained skeptical. They had seen firsthand the devastation the Mongols had wrought. They knew that Europe had not defeated them, but had simply been spared by the chance death of a distant ruler. The fear lingered. What if the Mongols returned? Would faith alone be enough next time? Yet, for now, the Vatican's decree reshaped history. The Pope's words turned fear into faith, despair into hope. And as Rome's bells rang out once more, their sound carried a message across the lands of Europe, a message of survival, of resilience, and of a victory that had come, not by the sword, but by the hand of God. History is shaped by moments, by the beating of a heart, by the breath of a ruler. In one timeline, Ögedei Khan, the ruler of the Mongol Empire, succumbs to indulgence and excess, leaving behind a power vacuum that halts the greatest invasion Europe has ever known. But what if he lived? What if fate had granted him more years, more time to see his grand vision to completion? With Ögedei still seated upon the throne of the Mongol Empire, the great recall never comes. Batu Khan and Subotai, unchecked by the call to return to Karakorum, push forward. Vienna does not stand. Its walls crumble beneath the force of Mongol siege engines, its people fall to the sword. With the gates of Central Europe shattered, nothing stands between the Mongols and the heartlands of France and Germany. Paris, the proud city of kings, prepares for war. But its armies, though valiant, cannot withstand the speed and precision of Mongol cavalry. The Seine runs red as the city is sacked, the great cathedral of Notre Dame burned in the chaos. Rome follows, its holy see reduced to rubble, the Pope fleeing to the safety of distant shores. Europe, once divided by rivalries, is now bound together only in the shared terror of their conquerors. With the fall of the continent, the Mongols established their rule, integrating Europe into the vast fabric of their empire. Trade flourishes along the newly secured Silk Road, blending east and west like never before. European knights adopt Mongol tactics, their feudal systems dissolving under the weight of the new ruling order. The Renaissance as we know it does not come. Instead, a new age dawns, an age of Mongol dominance, where science, art, and philosophy develop under the watchful gaze of the Khans. But history is a wheel that turns without mercy. Would this empire have lasted, or would it, like all before it, eventually fracture? Would the Mongols hold Europe for generations, or would the flames of rebellion rise from the ashes of its former kingdoms? The what-ifs are endless, the answers lost to the sands of time. But one truth remains: had Ögedei Khan lived, the world as we know it would be unrecognizable. The walls of Vienna had withstood countless sieges, standing as an unbreakable barrier against those who wished to conquer the heart of Europe. But no enemy had been like the Mongols. In the cold, unforgiving winter of 1242, the fate of the city was sealed. It was no longer a question of if Vienna would fall, but when. For weeks, the defenders had held out, their knights repelling charge after charge, their archers firing volleys into the relentless tide of Mongol warriors. But the Mongols were patient. They did not fight on the terms of their enemies. They adapted, studying the weaknesses of Vienna's fortifications, exploiting every crack in its defenses. Siege engines, brought from the depths of the east, hurled fire and stone into the once proud walls, reducing them to rubble piece by piece. Then, on a fateful dawn, the final assault began. The defenders, weary and malnourished, stood atop the remaining battlements, watching as the Mongol war drums echoed through the valley. A storm of arrows blackened the sky, forcing the defenders to take cover. Then came the siege towers, massive wooden behemoths crawling forward under the cover of darkness. Flames roared through the city as Mongol incendiary bombs ignited homes, churches, and marketplaces alike. The city's last hope lay in its remaining knights, who launched one desperate charge to break through the enemy lines. But they never stood a chance. The Mongols, masters of deception, feigned retreat, drawing the knights into a trap. Within minutes, the heavy cavalry found themselves surrounded, cut down before they could even turn back. The last defenders of Vienna fell where they stood, their banners trampled beneath the hooves of Mongol horses. As dawn broke over the city, Vienna was no more. Its people, those who survived, were dragged from their homes, bound in chains, their fates sealed as slaves to the empire. The great churches, once filled with prayers of salvation, now lay in ruin. The streets, once alive with merchants and nobles, were littered with the dead. News of Vienna's fall sent shockwaves across Europe. The Holy Roman Empire had lost its jewel. France and England, once consumed by their own rivalries, now understood the terrifying reality: they were next. The Mongols had proven that no wall, no army, no faith could withstand them. Europe, once so sure of its divine protection, now stood naked before the storm. And so, as the fires of Vienna smoldered in the distance, the Mongols turned their gaze westward. The road to Paris and Rome lay open, and nothing stood in their way. The fall of Vienna had sent shockwaves across Europe. The last true barrier against the Mongol advance had crumbled, and now, the horsemen of the steppes rode westward with nothing to stand in their way. The kingdoms of France and the Papal States, once bastions of civilization, now braced for annihilation. In Paris, King Louis IX stood atop the battlements of his fortress, gazing eastward at the ominous dust clouds rising on the horizon. Messengers arrived breathless, their faces pale, delivering grim news from the east. "The Mongols are coming," they whispered, their voices trembling. The streets of Paris filled with hurried preparations, walls reinforced, weapons distributed, churches packed with desperate citizens praying for divine salvation. But prayers would not stop what was coming. Meanwhile, in Rome, Pope Gregory IX called upon all of Christendom to stand together in defense of the Holy See. His letters reached every corner of Europe, urging knights, kings, and commoners alike to take up arms against the coming storm. From the Vatican, the Pope delivered a decree: "This is not merely war, this is a battle for the soul of Christendom. The Mongols are the scourge of God, and they must be stopped." Yet, despite the desperate efforts, the Mongols had perfected the art of conquest. They did not waste time in prolonged sieges. They struck like lightning, surrounding cities, cutting off supplies, and unleashing their devastating arsenal of siege engines and gunpowder weapons. The skies above Paris darkened as flaming projectiles rained down, igniting entire districts in hellish infernos. The air was thick with smoke, the streets filled with the screams of the dying. Notre Dame, a symbol of faith and endurance, stood defiant but vulnerable. Rome fared no better. The Holy City, once the heart of the Christian world, now faced a wrath it had never known. Mongol banners fluttered outside its walls, and their war horns howled through the night. Siege towers crept forward, firebombs illuminated the night sky, and the city's defenders, though brave, knew that no divine intervention would come to halt the onslaught. The Tiber ran red with the blood of those who had dared to resist. As the days turned to weeks, it became clear neither Paris nor Rome could withstand the full fury of the Mongol war machine. The gates of Paris splintered under the relentless assault, and Mongol cavalry poured into the streets, cutting down any who stood in their way. The City of Lights was reduced to smoldering ruin. In Rome, the Vatican fell, its relics scattered, its sacred halls echoing with the clash of steel and the cries of the fallen. The Pope fled into exile, his words of faith drowned beneath the drumbeats of war. Europe, once so certain of its divine protection, now lay broken beneath the hooves of its conquerors. The dream of resistance had died in the flames of its greatest cities. And as Mongol banners flew high over the ruins of Western civilization, the world entered a new era, one ruled by the steppe warriors who had reshaped history itself. With Paris and Rome in ruins, the last vestiges of European resistance had been snuffed out. The Mongols, no longer mere invaders, were now rulers of an unfamiliar land. The vast and fractured nations of Europe were forced into a new existence, one under the watchful eye of the great Khan's governors. The age of kings was over, the age of Mongol dominion had begun. Unlike the despots of Europe's past, the Mongols did not seek to erase cultures. Instead, they assimilated, governing through a delicate balance of fear and pragmatism. The once independent kingdoms were reorganized into Mongol administrative provinces, each overseen by a governor loyal to the Khagan and Karakoram. Taxes were imposed, trade routes secured, and rebellion swiftly crushed with the same ruthless efficiency that had toppled empires before them. In the streets of London, the nobility was forced to bow before Mongol-appointed administrators. In Rome, what remained of the papacy operated under careful scrutiny, its influence now depended on the goodwill of its new overlords. The Mongols, ever practical, did not outlaw Christianity, but they ensured that faith did not interfere with governance. The Pope, once the most powerful figure in Europe, now answered to a foreign court. Economically, Europe was transformed. The Mongol Empire connected the continent to the Silk Road like never before. Caravans filled with Chinese silk, Persian spices, and Central Asian warhorses flooded the markets of Europe. Gold and silver flowed eastward, enriching the Mongol war machine while European craftsmen adapted to Mongol demands for new weaponry and fortifications. The medieval feudal system, already strained, collapsed as a centralized taxation system, inspired by Mongol efficiency, took its place. But life under Mongol rule was not without suffering. Dissent was met with merciless retribution. Any attempt at rebellion was crushed before it could spread, entire villages razed in warning. The Mongols had no tolerance for insubordination. To resist was to invite annihilation. And so, across the once great kingdoms, a quiet submission settled in. Some European lords found their place within the new order, serving as vassals under Mongol rule, while others vanished into the pages of forgotten history. Yet, even under foreign dominion, the embers of defiance smoldered. Secret meetings were held in the ruins of cathedrals, whispers of rebellion passed through the shadows. The question was no longer whether Europe had been conquered, it had. The question now was whether it would ever be free again. With the fall of Paris and Rome, the final embers of European resistance faded. The Mongols had not merely conquered Europe, they had reshaped it. The West, once defined by warring kingdoms and fractured alliances, now existed under a single banner, the Pax Mongolica. And under the rule of the great Khans, the world entered a new age. The old European feudal order collapsed, its nobility either extinguished or absorbed into the Mongol hierarchy. Instead of monarchs ruling by divine right, governors appointed by the Khagan oversaw vast territories, ensuring that tribute and trade flowed uninterrupted. Roads, once crumbling and dangerous, were repaired and secured under Mongol law. Bandits vanished, piracy diminished, and for the first time in centuries, merchants traveled without fear from London to Beijing. The Silk Road, now reinforced by Mongol outposts, connected the known world like never before. Ideas, technologies, and cultures merged in unprecedented ways. Arabic mathematics influenced European scholars, Chinese engineering transformed European architecture, and Mongol military doctrine became the standard for warfare. The Renaissance as we knew it did not occur. Instead, a new kind of enlightenment emerged, one driven by Mongol pragmatism, where knowledge was valued above lineage and power was dictated by merit rather than birth. Yet, for all its advancements, this new world was not without its shadows. The Mongols had brought order, but at a cost. Freedom, as it had once been understood, was a relic of the past. The power of the church had been shattered, its authority reduced to mere ceremonial functions. Revolts were rare but ruthlessly crushed, entire cities erased as reminders of what defiance would bring. And though prosperity reigned, so too did an underlying fear, the knowledge that the great Khans ruled with an iron fist, and that their favor could be as fleeting as the wind. As the decades passed, Europe became unrecognizable. A continent once divided by language and culture now spoke a common tongue, the language of empire. Mongol architecture rose where castles once stood, their distinct domes and sprawling plazas symbols of a new age. The descendants of old kings served in the courts of Mongol overlords, their lineages remembered only in fading manuscripts. The Mongol dynasty, having lasted for generations, became synonymous with stability, but at the cost of Europe's very identity. Some historians would later ask, had Europe truly been conquered, or had it been transformed? Was this an age of darkness, or had it merely been a different kind of civilization? The answers would be debated for centuries, but one truth remained undeniable. The world had changed, not through slow evolution, but through the unrelenting force of Mongol steel. And in this new world order, only one law mattered, the will of the Khagan. And so, history as we know it stands on the edge of possibility. The Mongols came closer than anyone could have imagined to reshaping Europe forever. What if Ögedei Khan had lived just a few more years? What if the Mongols had pushed further, cementing their rule over the West? Would today's world look anything like what we know? Would the Renaissance ever have occurred? Would the modern nations of Europe even exist? Perhaps the Mongols would have ruled for centuries, blending cultures and bringing Europe into a vast Eurasian empire. Or perhaps resistance would have risen from the ashes, forging a new world from the ruins of conquest. The possibilities are endless, and history is never as certain as we assume. But now, we turn the question to you. How do you think the world would have changed if the Mongol Empire had ruled Europe? Would it have led to an era of prosperity, or would it have stifled the very innovations that shaped modern civilization? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey into the great what-ifs of history, be sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. We have countless more untold stories, alternate realities, and historical twists waiting to be explored. What should we cover next? Drop your suggestions below. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and remember, history is never set in stone.